Hi everyone, thanks for clicking and watching. It's an honor to be with you for just a few moments. I want to talk to you about leadership. It is a subject that has taken a lot of books and a lot of podcasts and a lot of conferences and seminars. And before you click off, because you're not a leader, I would actually challenge you and say you are. I actually think everyone has leadership. Everyone has leadership potential. And the Bible talks a lot and teaches a lot about leadership. One of the greatest leaders in the Bible is a man by the name of Moses. I've spent actually the last couple months preaching on, teaching on, studying, immersing myself in the life of Moses. And over the last couple years, I've jotted down some leadership lessons that I think are really clear and really important and really challenging from the life of Moses. And I want to take the next little bit and share those with you. And certainly, I believe you are a leader, and I believe you have great leadership potential, as I said. But leadership looks differently. Some people are leaders of companies and churches, of organizations, of teams. Some people are leaders in their neighborhoods or their neighborhood association or government. Some are leaders in their families, to extended family, or a leader in their home, to their wife or to their husband or to children or to grandchildren or whatever it may be. There's leadership, and there's leadership challenges and responsibilities that each of us face. And so I want to just kind of give you some leadership lessons that I think God has kind of shown me in the life of Moses throughout his ministry. Certainly, this is not all of them. There are many, many more. But these are some ones that are important to me, encouraging to me. The first one is this: God makes leaders. God makes leaders. There is some backstory to Moses that I think is really interesting, that helps us understand some of Moses's leadership frustration. Moses was raised in the palace of Egypt for 40 years. So for 40 years, he was educated at the highest levels. We would consider it university and Ivy League. He was educated at the highest levels of Egyptian education. The Bible tells us in the New Testament that he was mighty in words and he was mighty in deed. So he had extraordinary ability. And we actually even see that in the Bible. He wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which are incredible books. And the range of topics and literature, looking at it just from that standpoint, is really incredible. But he was mighty in word and deed. And then at 40 years old, he feels this sense from God that he is going to be used to deliver the people. And so he begins this quest, this crusade to free the people, his people, the Israelites, from Egyptian slavery. And so he goes out one day and he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite slave. And he rises up and he strikes down the Egyptian taskmaster. He murders him. And it wasn't, again, we can look at that. It was wrong in some ways for him to do that. But he felt like he was doing the right thing. He felt like he was acting to protect the people that he was going to lead. And we know that was his thought, because in Acts chapter 7, Stephen says this of Moses' thought process. He thought that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. So the next day Moses goes out and he has had what in his mind seems to be a victory. He has freed one man from the oppressive slave master, taskmaster, and he goes and he sees a conflict between 2 Israelites and he tries to be the mediator. And one of them looks at Moses and says, "What, are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" And it's revealed at that moment to Moses that he has been found out, and Pharaoh, the chief, right, the king of Egypt, seeks the life of Moses. And so Moses abandons his Egyptian life, abandons his culture there, abandons that aspiration to be the deliverer, and he flees into the wilderness for another 4 decades. Then God comes to him. God comes to him when he's 80 years old. He's no longer the mighty Moses, the man mighty in word and deed. He has fallen all the way down the socioeconomic ladder. He's at the bottom of Egyptian socioeconomic class. He's a shepherd. And he's a shepherd not even of his own flock. He's taking care. He works for his father-in-law. It's all his father-in-law's sheep. And that's when God comes to him and commissions him as a leader. We need to understand that God makes leaders, but he does so in his timing. There's a passage in 1 Peter, a warning about really humility, but a warning that really is important in understanding leaders and leadership. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6 says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you." God makes leaders, and he does so in his timing. And oftentimes there's this restlessness for that promotion, or there's this restlessness for the opportunity to bring change that you desperately see needs to happen, maybe in your school, maybe in your church, maybe in your community, maybe in government, and you see that change and you want to, if you will, grab the bull by the horns, be a man, be a woman of action. And sometimes the best thing is to sit still and say, God, when you want me to be a leader, when you want me to step into that particular spot, I'm going to wait for you to do that. Moses went for 40 years in the backside of the desert, being a nobody. And then when he's 80 years old, God says, okay, you're ready to be the deliverer. You're ready to be used at this moment. So what do we know from those passages? God makes leaders, and he does so in his time. Second leadership principle, and again, there are many from the life of Moses, but this is an important truth about leaders. The second thing is this: you can't do it alone. You can't do it alone. Often what happens with leaders is the danger, like 1 Peter talks about, with pride. It's humbling yourselves under the mighty hand of God, so at his time, in his way, in his moment, he can use you for his glory in a leadership spot. But we have to do so realizing that leadership is not a singular act. We don't just get to do that by ourselves. And with Moses, that's proven multiple times. There's an event in Exodus 17, in verse number 8 down to verse number 16, where there's a battle happening and Moses is up on a mountain and Joshua, his assistant, is leading the army down in the valley against the Amalekites. And this kind of this mysterious miracle happens where basically if Moses' hands and arms stay up, his people are prosperous. If his arms and his hands go down, then his people begin to be defeated. And so he holds up his arms as long as he can. And then these two people come alongside of him, Aaron and a man named Hur, H-U-R, come and they hold up Moses' arms. Here's why. Moses couldn't be a leader all by himself. Moses couldn't accomplish the task all by himself. And in the very next chapter, Exodus chapter 18, Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, views that Moses is busy day and night solving all these very trivial, in many cases, problems in the nation. He says, you need to start delegating these things out. Here's why. Because leaders recognize we can't do it on our own. We can't do it on our own. And there's this temptation, this prideful temptation in leadership to be a one-woman, to be a one-man show. And you're going to handle it by yourself. And you can't. You can't do it. Even Jesus comes and he's perfect. He's the greatest teacher, the greatest leader, the greatest man, right, to ever walk the face of the planet, fully God, fully man. And yet he invites 12 apostles to be part of his team because we can't do it alone. So first thing is God makes leaders. Second thing is you can't do it alone. And that's okay. Just admit that. It doesn't make you weak. Doesn't make you a loser. It doesn't even make you a bad leader. It just makes you an honest leader to recognize, hey, you can't do it on your own. So find people to partner with. Find those guys that will hold up your arms and hold up the mission and hold up what you're trying to accomplish. The third thing is found in the book of Numbers. And it is this very important principle that we've kind of hinted at already with leadership. And it's simply this: always be humble. Always be humble. The Bible there in Numbers chapter 12, and I happen to think that Moses didn't write this part. I think his assistant later on put it in, but there's some disagreement about that, and that's okay. But Numbers chapter 12 in verse 3, it says of Moses, "Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth." The Bible actually calls Moses the most humble man on the face of the planet. Leadership has a poison, a danger that often goes straight to the ego and the head of leaders. We start to look around maybe at what we're accomplishing or what our church or our organization or our school is accomplishing, and we're like, my goodness. It's kind of the Nebuchadnezzar, that king from the book of Daniel, that complex. We kind of walk out and we look around and we're like, look at what I've built. And it is in that pride that the Bible says that God tears down the house of the proud. So God makes leaders, and we can't do it alone, and we have to recognize that. And there's a humility that comes, again, the chicken and the egg, right? There's a humility that precedes recognizing that. Then there's a humility that continues to grow in recognizing that God has put us in that spot. We can't do it alone. The Bible warns against pride, and that is super dangerous and destructive for a leader. And what often happens with pride is that when we have that leadership and God has to bring us down and God has to humble us, there's peripheral hurt. There's damage that happens. There's collateral damage around. People get hurt because we allowed our heads to swell. We allowed our ego to grow, and we became prideful. So the leadership lesson is always to stay humble. Another one there in the book of Numbers is in Numbers chapter 16. And again, these are somewhat out of sequence, and it's okay. But Numbers chapter 16, a problem arises. And Moses as a leader dealt with lots of problems. There were problems all the time because there were so many people. And with people and with progress, there's always going to be problems. But he had to deal with it. And one of the things that happens sometimes as a leader is we're afraid to deal with, or we're too fatigued to deal with problems. So the fourth leadership lesson from Moses is this: don't be afraid to deal with problems. Problems exist. Problems exist as a family. You're a leader in your home. There's problems in your marriage, or there's problems with your kids, or there's problems financially, there's problems in your work, or there's problems with a coworker, or there's problems with your boss, problems in the school, whatever it may be, problems in the neighborhood. Don't be afraid to deal with those problems, because they don't go away. They don't go away, and they rarely, if ever, just kind of shrink and become smaller. They often just continue like a snowball to balloon and grow and become a much bigger problem if they're not dealt with. So leaders, don't be afraid to tackle problems. I found a couple of years ago when I took a sabbatical, it was time away. I was thankful to the Lord for that timing. Even now, looking back at some things in my own life, thankful for the timing. But I remember coming back after being gone for 40 days. And I remember coming back, my wife and kids and I, we came back to Michigan after 40 days, and man, did I feel fresh. I felt this freshness and this clarity in my heart and in my mind. And as soon as I hit the ground, there were problems that I knew I should have tackled before that I started tackling. And so rest is important. Fighting off fatigue, not just powering through, but making sure to get rest, making sure to take time off, because problems are going to arise, and good leaders, responsible, faithful leaders, are not afraid to tackle problems. The problem there was a rebellion, and it would have been easier just to be like, these guys, let's try to pacify them. And that wasn't the right solution. The solution was to deal with the problem in truth, in love, and to handle those things. So good leaders are not afraid to handle problems. Another leadership principle that's actually back a couple chapters is found in Numbers chapter 12. And it's a time of difficulty. It is a time of problems. But what's interesting about this problem is the assault against Moses, the attack on his leadership, doesn't come from ambitious, rebellious, men in the community, men like in the later chapter, in chapter 17 there, or chapter 16. It comes from people that are close to him. It comes from his brother, and it comes from his sister. It comes from people close to him. And man, I can't even imagine how difficult that was for Moses to endure. If we go back to the first principle that God makes leaders, I think one of the most important truths for me as a leader is to remember in times of difficulty that we rest in, that we're secure in God's confirmation of our leadership. God's confirmation of our leadership. If we believe that God makes leaders, if we believe that God has put us into leadership in our home or in our church or in community or school or government, whatever it might be, we rest in that truth that God has placed us there, especially in times of difficulty, especially in times of those moments where people are attacking that maybe we've made some leadership mistakes, which we're going to. We begin to maybe feel insecure about our leadership, and an insecure leader is a really dangerous leader, because then there's this overcompensating and this authoritative approach. When we as leaders find that God put us in that spot, and when times of difficulty come, we come back to that truth, then we rest in that. We rest in his confirmation of our leadership. That's so crucial. In Numbers 13 is another leadership principle, and it's one that I know the story as being a kid growing up in Sunday school and hearing the song, but is this: as leaders, we need to recognize that sometimes, and I want to go on a limb here and say often, sometimes though is the nice way of saying it, but often the majority is wrong. Sometimes and oftentimes the majority of people are wrong. There were 12 leaders amongst the families of the nation of Israel that were chosen to go and see the promised land. 12 of them go and they spend 40 days spying out the land, seeing the land, traveling through the land. They come back and the people are eager. They want to hear the report of what the promised land looked like. They come back. There's 12 spies, 12 leaders. These are not like chumps. These are the top representatives of each of the families, each of the tribes of Israel. 10 of them come back and say, we can't do it. 10 of them, right? An overwhelming majority come back and say, we can't do it. And 2 guys, a guy named Joshua and a guy named Caleb, come back and say, God told us we could do this. We've seen it. Let's believe God and go take this. And yet, what did the people do? The people sided with the 10. And there was a very, very small minority of people who wanted to go to the promised land, but they were overrun by the majority. Oftentimes, the majority is wrong. Now, not always. Sometimes there's this arrogance. We have to stay humble. But there's this arrogance as leaders to be like, well, I know right, and all these other people don't know. That's not the heart. But sometimes as leaders, we have to realize that the majority is wrong. And there is a willingness for a good leader to stand alone. To stand alone for what is right in our family, with our extended family. Sometimes that's very hard. There's an expectation to play a role, to be this or to be that. And sometimes being a good leader is standing alone. I know it sounds silly, but I think sometimes the cheese stands alone. But sometimes, man, you just got to realize that it's okay to stand alone as a leader. It's okay to look and go, man, the majority is wrong. And that will be founded on God's word and on truth and on righteousness and on justice. And to look and go, man, these students in my school or these other teachers or my coworkers or my friends, I have to stand alone and be a leader, lead by example, lead by speaking the truth in love, but I'm going to be in the minority. And that's hard. That's very difficult to do. But we have to understand that sometimes, and I would say oftentimes, the majority is wrong. The other thing about leadership later on in the book of Numbers, it's in Numbers chapter 27. There's some neat stories in the book of Numbers. It's a kind of an ignored book. Leviticus is difficult and challenging to read. Deuteronomy is great. I love Deuteronomy. But Numbers, sometimes the census and things is a little hard, laborious to push through. But in Numbers chapter 27, it's revealed to Moses that it's already been revealed, he's not going to lead the children of Israel into the promised land, but he's going to appoint a successor. So God says there in Numbers 27, verse 18, so the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom the Spirit is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Make him stand before Eleazar the priest and all the congregation, and you shall commission him in their sight. You shall invest in him with some of your authority, that all the congregation of the people of Israel may obey. This is something about leadership that I really think goes back to the humility thing, but is so lost in leadership of every kind. I've seen it in churches. My vantage point is being a pastor. I've seen it countless times. One of the things that leaders fail to do is invest in and prepare and appoint a successor. That is one of the most crucial things about being a leader. It's hard, it's difficult. It acknowledges that in many cases that you're older, that your pace, that your ability, that your time has come to an end in a church or in an organization or in a school or in a community, and you have to move forward with your life, change gears, move on to something different. That's really hard. It's very difficult, and many people in leadership do not do it. They do not actively develop, invest, and then appoint a successor. God says, take Joshua and lay your hand on him. Joshua had been the assistant, secretary in some ways, but the assistant to Moses. Joshua grew up as a slave. Moses grew up in the palace. So there was this education, this training, this development of Joshua for 40 years. 40 years Moses invested in his successor. And then Joshua was able to lead the people of Israel over the Jordan River and into the promised land. Wherever you are as a leader, invest in a successor. Let me say it this way. If you're a parent, you're a mother, you're a leader to your children, invest in the next generation. That's incredibly important. The idea of vicariously living through kids or vicariously living through people that we're leading or leading people for our benefit is not the way that Jesus taught us how to lead, is not the way that Moses led, is not the biblical paradigm of leadership. Jesus said, if you want to be a leader, be the servant of all. If you want to be first, then be last. Take the lowest seat. That's why Jesus in John 13 washed the disciples' feet, because he wanted to set an example. So leadership is not about people serving for your benefit and your joy and your promotion and your exaltation. Leadership is, as my college called it often, servant leadership. It's serving other people. One of the primary ways we do that is investing in and trusting a successor and doing that actively. Maybe you're a boss. Do you have someone in training that's going to take your spot? Maybe you're a supervisor. Are you investing in one person or in multiple people on your team or in your company that is seeing your trust and your care and your development and your teaching and your training? To me, that is one of the most awesome ways that we can live differently in the workplace and point people to the gospel. You see, because that's what this is all about. See, I have dozens and dozens of leadership books, many that I've read, many that I've enjoyed, some that I've thrown across the room, but some that I enjoy from all different walks of life and different businesses and older books and newer books. And there's all kinds of leadership books. But for us, it's not about leadership just to be a good leader. For us, being good leaders is about pointing people to the ultimate leader, Jesus Christ. It's about a gospel effort. And so I want to go through those things because I want you to see that if we just peel back one layer, It's an extraordinary gospel opportunity. God makes leaders. So we see that. We can't do it alone. That invites people into community and into relationship with us. We're always going to be humble. In times of difficulty, we're going to rest in the Lord has put us in that spot. We're not going to be afraid to deal with problems. We're going to invest in a successor. We're going to realize that sometimes we have to stand alone. Well, you start looking through those things, and there are others, but like you pray for those that you're leading. We see Moses doing that in the book of Exodus. We as leaders keep our temper. Moses was often tempted to get frustrated with the people. Sometimes he kept it cool. Sometimes he lost his temper. There was damage and destruction. Again, more collateral damage for leadership failure. But all of those things as a Christian, what do? They give us, when we live those things out, they give us opportunity to point our wives, our husbands, our children, our coworkers, the people in our neighborhood associations, the people in clubs that we're part of, or charities that we're part of, or businesses that we're part of. When we do those things, we live them out, it gives us opportunity to point to the why. And the why is the transformation of the transforming power of the gospel, the transformation that God has brought into our life by recognizing that we're broken people, that we're flawed people. There's that humility there, that we have rebelled and sinned against God, that what God designed to be perfect, we broke in our sin. And this is the wonderful thing. Jesus comes, he is the perfect leader. He's the example that we are to follow. And when people see us acting in a really countercultural way, when they see us acting humility, when they see that it's not about us stepping on someone else or pushing someone down so we can climb the corporate ladder or so that we can climb higher in an organization, when they see that humility, when they see that graciousness, when they see that investment, that genuine investment in their lives, in their success, that is such a backwards way of living. People are going to look and go, why are you doing that? And the answer is Jesus did it for us. He was rich. He had all of the glory of heaven. And for our sake, Paul says, he became poor. Fully God, fully man. And there he is, born in a manger, working as a handyman in Nazareth. He humbles himself, Philippians 2 says, to death, even death on the cross. That's what Jesus did for us. And so our leadership is a shadow. It's a gigantic, pointing neon arrow that says, man, I want you to see Jesus in the way that I lead my family, the way that I lead as a boss, the way that I lead my coworkers, the way that I lead my team, the way that I supervise, the way that I lead my sports team, the way that I'm a coach. All of those leadership opportunities are opportunities for the gospel. And what happens is we fall into the trap of ego. And what that does is that eliminates the opportunity for us to point to the gospel. That eliminates the opportunity as Christian leaders to point to what Jesus has done in our life. So what do? We humble ourselves. God says, I'll give grace to the humble. Grace to the humble. So we follow the example of Moses, his leadership there, but ultimately it's Jesus's example, because we want to point people to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ for the saving of their soul, for the transformation of their life, for the rescuing, for the escaping from God's righteous wrath, and the adoption into the family of God and the security of eternal life. That's what being a good leader is about. So wherever you are a leader, man, I hope that you'll look at what the New Testament says, these things, Moses and Joshua and all of these events in the Old Testament. They're not just Christian fairy tales, right? They're not just the religious fairy tales that we read to our kids. These are stories, the New Testament says, that serve as an example to us. And they're an example that we want to follow, but then ultimately, at the core of all of them is Christ, is pointing to the hope of the gospel. So I want to encourage you as a leader in your school, leader on your sports team, or maybe you are the coach, a leader in the PTA or the PTO or whatever organization you might be part of or volunteering in, a leader in your family, a leader in your home, a leader to your siblings, a leader to your parents, your you're a leader to your grandchildren, whatever it is, that you'll embrace that leadership role that God has put you in. And you'll look at things like this and you go, okay, this is what I want to live out. You'll begin to put some of these leadership lessons from the life of Moses into practice. Thanks for watching, everybody.